There is a clay tablet sitting in the collection of one of the oldest museums in Europe, and on that tablet, pressed into the surface almost 5,000 years ago, is the name of a woman. She is described as being taken from a rib. She is described as the mother of all living things. She is described as the one who was made to heal a wound and to give life where life was ending. Every element of that description matches, almost word for word, the woman we know as Eve. There is only one problem. That is not her name. The name written on the tablet is Ninti, not Eve, not Shava, not Hawa, Ninti. And the writing on that tablet predates the earliest known version of the Book of Genesis by at least 1,000 years, possibly longer. For most of the last century, a small group of Assyriologists, linguists, and historians of religion have been quietly circling this problem. Because if the name on the tablet is the original, and the name in Genesis is the substitution, then something happened between the writing of that clay and the writing of the Hebrew scripture. Something deliberate. A woman had her name taken, her role rewritten, her origin story lifted, edited, and pinned onto a different figure, in a different language, in a different theology. And the fingerprints of the original are still there, hiding inside a wordplay that only works in Sumerian. This is the story of the tablet that names the original Eve, what she was actually called, what she was actually said to do, who first identified the switch, and why almost no one outside a narrow academic circle has ever heard about it. And most importantly, why her name had to be changed at all, because that answer, more than any other, is what makes people uncomfortable. The Sumerians were the first civilization to write. That is not opinion, that is the current scholarly consensus, and it has been the consensus for a long time. They rose in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, in what is now southern Iraq, roughly 6,000 years ago. And they built the first cities, the first legal codes, the first schools, the first temples with recorded liturgies, and the first library archives. They also wrote down their gods, meticulously, obsessively, on tens of thousands of clay tablets that were fired, buried, forgotten, and then dug up again in the 1800s by European archaeologists who had no idea what they were looking at. The Sumerian gods were not abstractions. They had names, families, jobs, tempers, and detailed origin stories. Two of the most important were a pair. The first was Enki, a god associated with water, with wisdom, with craftsmanship, and, in a detail that will matter enormously in a moment, with the creation and preservation of humanity. The second was a goddess called Ninhursag, sometimes called Ninma, sometimes called Nintu. She was the Great Mother. She was the one who shaped human beings out of clay, according to the Sumerian creation narratives, working alongside Enki as the birth goddess of the whole species. And in one of the strangest, oldest, and most quietly explosive myths in the entire Sumerian corpus, Enki and Ninhursag share a story that reads, from beginning to end, like a first draft of the Garden of Eden. Quick pause. Everything you are about to hear, the garden, the forbidden plants, the god who ate what he was told not to, the goddess born from a rib, is in the companion document. Every tablet reference, catalog number, and the Sumerian pun that names the first woman, linked below, QR code on your screen. Back to the tablet. The story is called Enki and Ninhursag. It survives on tablets recovered from the ancient city of Nippur, and the most complete version was translated in the 1940s by an American scholar named Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent his entire career reconstructing Sumerian literature from broken clay. The setting of the myth is a paradise called Dilmun. Dilmun is described as pure, clean, bright, a place where nothing dies, where the lion does not kill, where the wolf does not seize the lamb, where sickness does not exist, where the eye disease does not say, I am the eye disease, where the headache does not say, I am the headache, where the old woman does not say, I am an old woman, and the old man does not say, I am an old man, where the young girl does not spend her days in weeping, where nothing yet has learned how to hurt. That is a direct paraphrase of the actual Sumerian text. Word for word, image for image, the description matches, in tone and structure, the description of Eden that would appear thousands of years later in a completely different language. A garden, a place where death is not yet real, a protected space that exists outside the normal rules of the world. It is, in every meaningful way, an Eden, and in that garden, there are plants, specific plants, 8 of them, in fact, cultivated by Ninhursag herself, each one distinct, each one named, each one forbidden to Enki. He is not supposed to eat them. He is told this explicitly. And of course, being Enki, he eats all of them anyway. What happens next is the moment that changes everything. Enki begins to sicken. 8 parts of his body fail him, 1 for each plant he swallowed. his jaw fails, his tooth, his mouth, his throat, his limb, his side, and, crucially, his rib. Ninhursag, watching this, is furious. She curses him, and then she leaves the garden. Without her presence, Enki begins to die. The other gods panic, because if Enki dies, the whole created order falls apart. He is the one who taught them how to make things. He is the one who shaped humanity. Without him, there is no water, no craft, no continuity. Eventually, Ninhursag is convinced to return. And when she returns, she does not simply heal him. She performs one of the strangest medical acts in world literature. She sits Enki down, and for each of the 8 sick parts of his body, she gives birth to a healing goddess. 8 goddesses, one for each wound. Each goddess is named according to the part she is meant to cure, and each name is a pun on the Sumerian word for that body part. The mechanism is worth pausing on, because it is one of the most elegant pieces of religious wordplay anywhere in the ancient world. The god names a sick body part. The goddess born to heal it is given a name that contains, embedded in it, the Sumerian word for that exact part. Enki says, "My jaw hurts." Ninhursag answers, "I have given birth for you to a goddess whose name carries the word for what soothes it." Enki says, "My mouth, my throat, my limb, my tooth, my side." For each part, a new goddess appears, each one named with a matched syllable, each one born specifically to heal the wound she is named after. It is a chain of puns 8 links long, and the chain culminates in the one that matters. The 7th of these 8 healing goddesses is the one this video is about. Enki says, "My rib hurts me." Ninhursag answers, "I have given birth for you to the Lady of the Rib." And the goddess who is born from that wound, born specifically to heal it, born from and for the rib itself, is given a name, Ninti. In Sumerian, the word T has 2 meanings. It means rib, and it means life. It is one of those coincidences of language that only happens in the ancient world, where a single syllable holds 2 ideas that seem completely unrelated in every other language on Earth, and yet in Sumerian they collapse into one sound. So the name Ninti means, at the exact same time, 2 things, Lady of the Rib and Lady of Life. She is the one born from the rib, and she is also the one who gives life, who is life, who mothers all living things. The 2 meanings are stacked on top of each other in a single word, and the myth uses both meanings deliberately. She heals the rib because she is the Lady of the Rib, and she brings life back to the dying god because she is the Lady of Life. The pun is the entire point of her name. Now hold that in your head, and let me read you a passage from a book that was written down at least 1,000 years later in a completely different language by a completely different people in a completely different theological tradition. In the 2nd chapter of the book of Genesis, a man named Adam is put into a deep sleep in a garden. A rib is taken from his side. From that rib, a woman is formed. She is brought to him. He gives her a name, and then, a few verses later, he gives her another name, and that second name is the one that stuck. Shava, Hawa, in English, Eve. And the reason he gives for that name is stated in the text itself. He calls her Eve, quote, because she was the mother of all living, unquote. Read that back slowly. Mother of all living, Lady of Life, and then remember where she came from. The rib. Every element of Ninti is preserved. The rib origin. The title of life giver. The role of mother of all who live. Every element is there. But the pun that made the name make sense, the pun that tied the rib and the life together into a single syllable, is gone. Because in Hebrew, the word for rib and the word for life are not the same word. They are not even close. The pun does not work. It only worked in Sumerian. Which means the Hebrew story is carrying, inside itself, the frozen skeleton of an older story it can no longer explain. The rib is there because it had to be. The life title is there because it had to be. But the reason the 2 are connected, the linguistic hinge that made the original name meaningful, has been amputated, left behind, preserved as a shape without a function. Kramer, the Assyriologist who first laid this out in the 1940s, was very careful with his conclusion. He did not say the Bible copied Sumer. He said, in the mildest academic phrasing he could manage, that the Genesis account appears to reflect an earlier Mesopotamian tradition, and that the rib motif is best explained by the Sumerian pun on tie. Kramer, it should be said, was not a fringe writer. He was arguably the single most important Sumerologist of the 20th century. He held the chair of Assyriology at the University of Pennsylvania. He translated more of the Sumerian corpus than any other scholar of his generation. When he said the rib in Genesis traces back to a Sumerian pun, that was not speculation from the margins. That was the head of the field speaking about his own subject. Since then, a long line of scholars has said essentially the same thing, in progressively less mild language. Thorkild Jacobsen, another giant of the field, made the same connection. Stephanie Dalley, whose translations of Mesopotamian myth are still standard in most universities, has treated the connection as effectively settled. The wider community of comparative religion has, over the last several decades, quietly folded the Ninti to Eve trajectory into its background understanding of how Genesis was assembled. The rib in Genesis is a linguistic fossil. It is a piece of Sumerian that got left in the Hebrew. That is not a fringe position. That is the mainstream reading, only spoken about in circles small enough that the general public rarely hears it. But if that is true, then something happened between Ninti and Eve. Somebody made a decision, and that decision is what this video is really about. Before we go into who changed the name, stop. Everything from here, the scribes, the exile, the reason the pun survived but the goddess did not, only lands with the tablet in front of you, the rib syllable, the 8 plants. It is all in the companion, linked below, QR code on your screen. Grab it, come back. The name change did not happen overnight, and it did not happen by accident. Somewhere in the long transmission of the story, between the Sumerian tablets of Nippur and the final compilation of the Hebrew Torah, a decision was made about what to keep and what to remove. The Sumerian version was polytheistic. That is the first thing that had to go. Ninti is one of 8 healing goddesses, born from a great mother goddess named Ninhursag, in a myth full of divine councils and quarreling gods and cursing and reconciliation. The Hebrew scribes who were compiling and editing the early chapters of Genesis were working under a completely different theological mandate. There was one God. There was no divine mother. There were no birth goddesses. There were no healing daughters. The entire pantheon had to be flattened into a single figure, and everything the pantheon used to do had to be reassigned or erased. The moment when this editing most likely happened is worth naming. Most modern biblical scholarship places the final compilation of the early chapters of Genesis during and immediately after the Babylonian exile, in roughly the 6th century before the Common Era. This is the period when the Judean elite was forcibly relocated to Babylon, into the direct cultural heartland of Mesopotamia. They were living, in other words, right on top of the surviving Sumerian and Akkadian religious material. They had access to the myths. They almost certainly knew them. And when the exiles returned and began the work of consolidating their own scriptures, they were doing so with the Mesopotamian source material fresh in their minds and threatening to their theology in equal measure. What emerged from that period was a Genesis that borrows the shape of the older myth while stripping out its content. The garden stays, the rib stays, the mother of the living stays. Everything that made those images divine and female and plural is quietly removed. So Ninhursag disappears. Enki is no longer a wounded god being healed. The 8 plants become 1 tree, or maybe 2, depending on how you read the garden. The 8 healing goddesses collapse down into a single woman, and that woman is given a new name, not Ninti, not Lady of the Rib in life, just Eve, Mother of the Living. The role is preserved, the origin is preserved, but the divine status is gone, and the name that carried the divine status is gone with it. This was not sloppy editing, it was surgical. The scribes kept exactly what the theology could tolerate, which was the origin from the rib and the title of life-giver, and they removed exactly what the theology could not tolerate, which was the goddesshood and the birth goddess lineage. Ninti was demoted, from a healing deity born to save a dying creator god, to a helper made from a sleeping man. Even the new name carries traces of the older layer. Hawa, the Hebrew behind the English Eve, is usually explained as coming from the root meaning to live, that is the surface reading. But Semitic linguists have long noted that the same consonantal shape shows up in older Aramaic and Phoenician material as a word tied to the serpent, to the mother goddess, to a whole class of ancient female cultic figures the redactors could not fully scrub. The name is doing double duty. On the surface it means life. Underneath, it still carries the residue of the older sacred category. And here is where the discomfort really starts, because you can track this demotion in the language itself. The Hebrew text calls her Ezer Kenegdo, a phrase usually translated as helper or helpmeet. But the older Sumerian material does not describe Ninti as anyone's helper. She is a birth goddess. She is a healer. She has her own agency, her own domain, her own reason for existing that does not depend on any man. The demotion is not just theological, it is social. It is the moment when the first woman stops being a deity in her own right and starts being an accessory to a male protagonist. The early Christian tradition then took this a step further. Church fathers writing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era doubled down on Eve as the source of the fall, as the cause of sin entering the world, as the reason humanity was expelled from paradise. Ninti, the healer, the one who was born to save a dying god, was now being remembered as the one who doomed the species. It is almost a complete inversion. The Lady of Life had been rewritten as the one who introduced death. And any memory of the older tradition, any surviving text that named her as Ninti, any liturgy that praised her as the birth goddess of humanity, was allowed to disappear. Not always by explicit destruction, often just by neglect. But the tablets survived for one very specific reason. Clay, once baked, does not rot. It does not burn easily. It does not decay in the way parchment or papyrus decays. When the great libraries of Sumer were destroyed by war and abandonment, the tablets in their storage rooms were often fired further by the very flames that consumed the buildings. The destruction preserved them. The result is that we now have, in museums scattered across Europe and North America and the Middle East, an almost unimaginable amount of primary source material from a culture that stopped existing more than 4,000 years ago. Legal contracts, business receipts, school exercises, astronomical records, medical prescriptions, and, most importantly for this story, a full library of religious literature, prayers, hymns, epics, myths, all copied out in cuneiform script by scribes who never imagined anyone would still be reading their words this far in the future. The tablets that concern us here were pulled out of the ground at a site called Nippur, one of the holiest cities of ancient Sumer, during a series of American-led excavations at the end of the 1800s. The dig teams recovered thousands of tablets from the ruins of the temple school there. Most of those tablets were shipped to museums in Philadelphia and Istanbul, where they sat in storage, largely untouched, for decades. It took another generation of scholars, working through the middle of the 20th century, to begin translating what was actually written on them. And it was in the middle of that work that the story of Enki and Ninhursag was pieced together for the first time. The tablets sat in the ruined mounds of Nippur and and Eridu for thousands of years while the new story was told and retold. And when Europeans finally dug them up in the 1800s and began to translate them, the discovery of Ninti was so quiet, academic, footnoted, and mostly ignored by the wider culture. The pun was noted. The parallel was noted. And then the conversation moved on. But the tablet is still there. The name is still on it. And every time someone reads the 2nd chapter of Genesis and wonders why, out of all the possible parts of the body, God chose the rib, the answer is sitting in a museum drawer in a European city, waiting for anyone who is willing to look. The rib was chosen because the original word for rib was the same as the original word for life. That is the entire reason. Take the pun away, and the rib makes no sense. Put the pun back, and everything clicks into place. The garden, the forbidden plants, the wounded creator, the woman born to heal him, her title as Mother of all living, all of it, in one syllable of Sumerian, thousands of years before the Bible was written. Some scholars have gone further. They argue that the deeper story is not just linguistic, it is theological. Ninti was worshipped. She had temples. She was invoked in birth rituals. Women prayed to her during labor. She was a full-status deity in a religion that recognized female divinity as a normal and central feature of the cosmos. Erasing her name was not just an editorial decision about a source text. It was the removal of an entire mode of worship, an entire way of understanding the sacred as something that could be female without qualification. And that, more than the linguistic evidence, is probably what made the change necessary in the first place. A god who is only male cannot afford to have his first woman be a goddess in her own right. She has to be reduced. She has to be renamed. She has to be given a role that supports the male protagonist rather than standing beside him with her own authority. Ninti could not survive that theological transition. Eve could. And so Eve is who we got. But the pun stayed. Frozen in the text. Preserved in the rib. A syllable of Sumerian, buried in a Hebrew scripture, still whispering the original name of the first woman to anyone who knows how to listen for it. There is one more piece of this, and it is the part that Assyriologists mention only in careful, hedged language, because the implications get large very quickly. The Sumerian myth of Enki and Ninhursag is not a folktale, it is a temple text. It was recited in ritual. It was copied by trainee scribes as part of formal religious education. This was not a story people told casually. It was a story people told sacredly. And in that sacred story, the first woman is not a mistake, not a warning, not the origin of sin. She is the healer of a dying God. She is the reason the created order does not collapse. She is, in the most literal possible sense, the mother of all living, because without her, everything living would have already died. That is the woman whose name was changed. That is the identity that was overwritten. Not a sinner, not an accessory. A goddess whose entire purpose was to keep life going when the god of creation himself was on the verge of failing. And her name was Ninti, Lady of the Rib, Lady of Life, both at once, in one word, in one language, on one tablet, still sitting in a museum drawer, still waiting. The pun is the evidence, the rib is the fingerprint, and the name on the clay is the one thing the scribes could not fully erase because they carried it with them, hidden inside the story they thought they were rewriting, all the way to the second chapter of Genesis, where anyone who looks closely enough can still see it. The question is not whether the change happened. The evidence for that is on the tablet. The question is what else was changed? What else was renamed? What other names, what other roles, what other goddesses are sitting inside the scriptures we still read, hiding in plain sight, waiting for a language nobody speaks anymore to give them back? Because Ninti is not alone. Once you notice the pattern is not subtle. There is Asherah, the consort of the high god in the older layers of Canaanite and even early Israelite religion, whose worship was systematically stamped out by later reformers, and whose name survives in the Hebrew Bible mostly as an object to be denounced. There is Inanna, the great Sumerian goddess of love and war, whose journey to the underworld predates and closely parallels the descent narratives that later show up in Greek and Christian material. There is Ninmah herself, sometimes called Mami, sometimes called Aruru, one of the actual creators of humanity in the Sumerian account, whose role in the birth of the species has almost no surviving analog in the monotheistic scriptures that inherited her story. The pattern is always the same. A goddess with real power, real function, real cultic worship gets absorbed. Her role is transferred to a male figure or to the single god. Her name is either erased outright or reduced to a footnote, a warning, a symbol of the wrong kind of religion. The story keeps her actions. It loses her identity. Ninti is the clearest case because the linguistic evidence is so tight. The pun is right there. Rib and life, one syllable, in one language, preserved as a shape, in another language, that no longer knows why the shape exists. But once you know how to see the pattern, you start seeing it in place after place. Genesis is not a book that was written from scratch. It is a book that was assembled out of older material by editors who had a very specific theological project. And the older material is still visible if you look for the seams. And when you start looking for it, you find it everywhere.